Hi. I want to talk a little bit about James Joyce. Just a few words. Joyce, of course, is one of the major modernist writers. He wrote a novel called Ulysses, which, when the 20th century was ending, and everybody's coming out with these lists of the best of the century kind of lists, like, top 100 movies. On a lot of those lists, Ulysses was number one for a novel of the 20th century. Right? Now, obviously, that's very subjective, but still, there is no denying the importance of Joyce. Ulysses, of course, is a very tough novel. When I was in college, I took a class, and that was the only book we read for that entire term was just Ulysses. I mean, that's how intense it is and long. He wrote a book called Finnegan's Wake, which even I have not been able to read because it is so obscure. Probably the most accessible novel that Joyce wrote, however, was Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. In fact, typically I've taught portrait many times actually in this class, but given the constrictions of the summer session, it seems like a better idea to go with his short stories. Nevertheless, the novel Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man is a very interesting, very important novel that follows the life of one Stephen Dedalus as he grows and matures to become an artist. Artist meaning a writer in this case, right? In other words, that Künstlerroman that we talked about earlier with Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Aurora Leigh, right? It's a very similar theme in Portrait, but incredibly different treatment. What we are reading this semester are two short stories. And they're both, how shall I put it, conventional in their use of language. Whereas as you go from Portrait to Ulysses to Finnegan's Wake, Joyce becomes more and more experimental. He is what we might call a maximalist. We've read some works, for instance, that require footnotes, especially now the modernism. Actually, entire books of notes have been written to go alongside Ulysses and Finnegan's Wake, especially because they're so intense and so dense with what modernists did, which was create lots of references and allusions that were obscure as kind of a detective work. The short stories Araby and The Dead, on the other hand, are much more conventional in that respect. They don't need intense footnotes. There are a few footnotes, but to be honest, you could probably get along without reading a single one of them if you just focus in on the story. Now, one of the things that is important in Joyce, and one of the things I'm asking you to write about or to think about with Joyce, is the issue of epiphany. And the notion of an epiphany is like a sudden coming to knowledge, a sudden understanding of things that you did not have before. The notion of the epiphany is like, bam, it's like a light bulb moment, right? The light goes off above your head and you go, oh. And you see things in a very different way than how you had right beforehand. And in Dubliners, the Dubliners is the name of the book that these two short stories appeared in, along with others. Joyce is working on this concept where the reader, following along with a character, either in the first person, in the case of Araby, or in the third person, more common in the case of The Dead, but we're following this character along in his story, in both these cases, a male protagonist. When something happens, and it's not a big thing, it's not an atom bomb blowing off, but something triggers an understanding, a realization, a way of seeing things that had been different than before that epiphany, right? And that's kind of the focus of the writing here. Um, Now, the stories are very different in some key ways. Araby is very short, first of all. It's a first person story told from the perspective of a young boy, not too young, but not an adult, probably a younger teenage type age. And he's very frustrated with his life and his circumstances. He's alienated in certain ways. For example, he is not being raised by his own parents. I hope you noticed that. Right? He's being raised by an aunt and an uncle. It's winter, it's dark. He lives in a dingy kind of environment. Right? Everything is, how should I put it, drab. Everything is just kind of, like, is this all there is to life? He has a very active imagination, right? He reads stories, heroic stories, right? Adventure type stories, things of this nature. Which kind of puts him into a realm where he is taken away from the life that he has around him in what we would call real life, and instead is just, taken away. But when the stories are over, there he is. Can't get away from your life. That's what he sees. This is a very working class and maybe even lower working class type environment. And this young man, unnamed, seeks to live something better. He creates, and I call it creating, a fascination with Mangan's sister. This is in large part because she's, quite frankly, the only girl around, right? Pretty much his whole world is very limited, right? What he sees is very limited. And so that he would kind of fixate on Mangan's sister is not surprising, okay, because there's not a whole lot else to do. He promises to go to Araby. Now, here's the fun part. Araby. Even the word sounds exotic. Arab, foreign lands. And especially, I think we're talking, long before the internet, long before TV, long before, contemporary means of communication could, take us immediately to any part of the globe practically. You could put on your, VR outfits, your virtual reality, and go to the top of the Empire State Building, or heck, even Mount Everest. None of that stuff is around, okay? None of that stuff is around. So Araby becomes, in his mind, this realm of possibility that things would be different. Things would be better. Things would be cool and interesting. And it would be fun. And he would be heroic. This is important. He would be heroic, right? Go and get something that he can then give to his liege lady, if you will, like a knight, right, in the Middle Ages. Well, I don't think I want to be a spoiler if you haven't read. But it's not a surprise, I think, to say that that's not exactly how things go for this young man. And what he finds there, and what he learns about the world, kind of reminds me of that old saying, if ignorance is bliss, 'tis folly to be wise. He gains a bit of wisdom, but I'm not sure happiness will follow. The Dead, the second story that I want you to think about, read, obviously. The third person narrative following Gabriel. not a bad man. In fact, in many ways, a very, very ordinary man. Right? He's a difference. Right? We leave everybody behind. Now we're in a little higher class. These people are more well-to-do. Right? And it's all about family. It's all about tradition. Right? And Gabriel is going to be the person who gives a toast at the party. Right? So what kind of man is Gabriel? He's a man who wears his galoshes. Now, here in San Diego, of course, we are seasonally challenged and, quite frankly, weather challenged. If you own galoshes while you live in San Diego, that would be kind of a surprise. Right? We don't really use them. We don't need them. But the galoshes are kind of a key. They're a signal. Gabriel is a cautious man. And in fact, in the time period in which this is written, galoshes are kind of uniformly looked down upon. Right? You don't need galoshes. That's excessive. Right? Now, again, in San Diego, where we hardly ever even see rain, a lot of us may not even own galoshes. I don't own galoshes. Probably very few people on this video would own galoshes, watching this video. Unless you had a second home somewhere, a vacation home. Do you have a second home? He needs them. Why? Because he's cautious. He thinks everything out. He plans, and he plans again. He thinks about how his speech will be received and modifies that. He doesn't want to be too much this way or too much that way, right? And Gabriel seems very self-satisfied. He's got a good life, as he sees it. And he sees the passage of time, the old and the young. And for most of this story, it's all good. I mean, he's got anxieties. Did he, say the wrong thing? Was he a little too much this way with the help or that way with the help? He reminds me a bit of Prufrock from the T.S. Eliot poem, The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock. Super self-conscious, right? Super self-conscious. And self-consciousness can, of course, lead to paralysis, right? Paralysis. And what doesn't move, of course. I mean, dead people don't move, right? Except in zombie movies, but we're not doing zombie movies right now. Until, right, we're ready for Epiphany. And again, I'm not going to be the spoiler. You need to read the piece and you need to get to it. But when he sees his wife kind of up on the stairs, and he kind of sees her almost from a different perspective. In other words, at first he doesn't recognize her, right? And, oh, wow. And then, oh, that's my wife. And he's got a hotel room for the night. All right. This could be a very fun evening for Gabriel. But things don't go quite that way. And his wife tells him a story. And I'm not going to give away what the story is. But that story is almost a shock to Gabriel's system. As he realizes something about himself, something about his wife, maybe something about this whole world around him that he hadn't seen before. And where he's placed in that realization, again, ignorance is bliss. 'Tis folly to be wise. Now he is wise, but that doesn't make him happy.